Good morning, good day, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. We have folks here, I think, from all across the globe, which is always exciting, a bit nerve-wracking for me and the panelists, but we'll do our best. My name is Vincent Pickett, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to today's Fulbright Impact in the Field panel. I'm the branch chief in the Fulbright office at the United States Department of State's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, and part of my portfolio is directing the global communication strategy for the program. So I'm always thrilled that part of my portfolio allows me to do things like this, which is both super exciting and very entertaining for everybody that's involved. So I wanted to thank first off my staff at the department and also our partners at IIE, which is our implementing partner, for putting this all together and for allowing us to visit with you from a safe social distance today in your homes. But first, before we get into the panel, for those of you who aren't already intimately involved in the Fulbright program, I thought that I'd give you just a little bit of background in the basics. Fulbright has supported almost 400,000 Fulbrighters over its almost 75 years of existence. We have a big party planned next year for the 75th, so tune back in for that. Fulbright's led by the United States government in partnership with 160 countries worldwide. It offers international educational and cultural exchange programs for students, scholars, artists, and professionals of all backgrounds, including leaders in the education sector, like the ones you'll hear from today. They study, teach, and carry out research or professional projects all across the world. It offers Americans a chance to go abroad and non-US citizens to come to the United States. Fulbright's primary source of funding is an annual appropriation by the US Congress to ECA. It also receives direct and indirect support from participating governments through Fulbright commissions, from host institutions, foundations, and the private sector. So it's a big collaborative effort by a number of stakeholders across the world to bring us this exciting program. And I want to put in a quick plug before we get started. For anybody who is inspired by this panel today, we are accepting applications for the 21-22 academic year, so please do look us up. Fulbright leaders are making an impact across the globe, and right now we're in a situation in which we're bringing this panel to you through technology because of the current environment. Many Fulbright alum are using skills that are gained during their Fulbright experience in their current roles at the forefront of the new education ecosystem that we're all sort of working in. Since the emergence of the coronavirus, Fulbrighters have been focused on supporting one another and supporting their communities to find innovative solutions for these countless new challenges that we face every day. And there have been some really amazing stories that we've captured about this. They can be found on our social media and on our websites. We know it's not easy out there for anyone, but sharing some of these stories, I think, really does make a difference and lift our spirits. So Fulbright alumni have used their skills and the experiences that they had during their Fulbright experience to not just advance their careers and make an impact on their fields, but to make a difference in their local and global communities. And we're very proud of all of them for that. So with that, I'd like to welcome you to our second Fulbright Impact in the Field panel. This panel is focused on education, on how teaching and learning are going online and all of the potential, as well as the pitfalls that go with it. We've all adapted to our online communication space with Zoom meetings at work, virtual happy hours for personal interaction, online learning for ourselves and for our children. And when there are new technologies, it's always a small miracle when they all sort of work out. I joined this meeting just a few minutes ago after a technical difficulty. So this joke was not going to be about me, but once we surmount those technical difficulties and all get in and people can make sure they hear us and see us, we have these small victories, which are kind of great. So I'm feeling good at the beginning of this webinar. And I didn't make the announcement, and neither did Kate, to mute your mics. So I feel like something's missing, but I feel like that's always the way we say hello these days. Today, our panelists are going to discuss the impact of the pandemic on teaching and learning, and we're very fortunate to have the assembled group of education leaders, policymakers, and teachers who are working every day to support students, families, and educators at all levels. At this time when the traditional notions of the classroom are being redefined and teaching and learning are being digitized. So I'm going to get into the panel introductions in just a second, but as for me, I have to say on a personal note, I have two small kids that are both doing online classes for both school and for out of school activities, which is an incredible amount of work for everyone that's involved, both the people that are putting on the classes, the kids who are doing them, the parents who are juggling the different platforms and technologies to make them happen, and serving as tech support, which I didn't think would be in my job description, but here we are. I come from a family of teachers. My parents are both public school teachers, or they just retired. My brother's a public school teacher in middle school in Chicago. My wife's an educational psychologist, and I used to work for the US Department of Education. So I feel a little bit more comfortable in this space than I did in our last panel, which was about public health in that field. But I'm very excited to hear what people have to say today. So these panels allow Fulbrighters to reach the general public and do a deeper dive into our Fulbright stories so we can learn more about the research and the practices that we consider to be sort of cutting edge in today's environment. So far, they've been all COVID related, which I think makes sense. We look forward to doing some more and then continuing these, as we move out into the future. Let me get to the panelist introductions. First of all, I'd like to thank the panelists for taking the time today and for all the prep work that goes into this and the work that you guys do every day. Let's start with Dr. James Avianetis, who is a 2019 Fulbright Visiting Scholar from Australia. He's the Associate Vice President for Research and Graduate Studies at Western Sydney University in Australia now. And for his Fulbright, he taught at the School of Politics, Public Affairs, and International Studies at the University of Wyoming. His current research focuses on political partisanship and the challenges that are confronting democracies. He's previously conducted research on the future of universities. So welcome. Dr. Angela Benson is a 2019 Fulbright US Scholar to Namibia. She is a professor of instructional technology at the University of Alabama. Her research addresses the role of culture in technology-mediated learning spaces, and she's taught a variety of educational courses about technology online. And though her Fulbright program was shortened due to this pandemic, she can tell you a personal story about that. She continues to serve as a Fulbrighter by teaching 3 first semester online graduate courses at the University of Namibia. So thank you for doing that. Next is Tammy Brecht Dunbar, who is a 2018 Fulbright teacher for the Global Classrooms program to India. Ms. Dunbar teaches 5th grade at Manteca Unified School District of California. In 2018, she was a fellow in the Fulbright Teacher and Global Classrooms program, traveled to India where she worked with students in New Delhi and Kolkata. She's a popular presenter and teacher trainer in the United States and around the world. She was also named California Woman in the Year for District 12 in 2016, as well as Teacher of the Year for a district in 2006. So welcome to Tammy. And next is Dr. Jane Lammerts, who is a 2019 Fulbright US Scholar to Indonesia and an Associate Professor of Education at the University of Rochester's Warner School of Education and Human Development, where she directs a secondary English teacher preparation program. She's also a founding associate director of the University's Center for Learning in the Digital Age, which is quite possibly what we could have named this panel. She recently returned from nearly 6 months as a US Fulbright Scholar to Indonesia, where she conducted research on Indonesian young people's interest-driven digital literacy practices in Central Java. So welcome to you as well. And finally, Dr. Patrice Moulton is a 2017 Fulbright Specialist in Nepal and a professor of psychology in the master's program for the clinical psychology at Northwestern State University in Louisiana. In 2017, she received the Fulbright Specialist Award to go to Nepal and continues her work there as a board member for the Empower Nepali Girls organization, which provides educational opportunities to girls at high risk for slavery. She's worked as an educator, administrator, practitioner, supervisor, and consultant for over 30 years, and she's authored multiple self-help and higher education textbooks on addiction, counseling, supervision, online teaching, and crisis counseling. Wow. So that is a distinct panel, and the introductions, thankfully, are now over, and we can get to the meat of this conversation, which I'm sure is what everyone is here to hear about. So I'm going to throw out the first question, and I'm going to ask that we have everyone answer this question. I think in the future, I may target some questions to specific people, but if anyone wants to jump in, please do go ahead and do so, okay? Because we really value all of your opinions, and we think that you're going to be able to contribute to a lot of these really great answers here. But first, I'd like to just go down the line and say, thank you for the work that you're doing. Can you tell us a little bit about your current position and what you're doing in the world of digital education, but also compare it with what you were doing a few months ago before this crisis hit. So let's start with Angela.
Oh, good morning. Oh, I don't know if it's morning or not. That's one thing that I'm having to learn. As Vincent said, I'm still teaching at the University of Namibia. So my classes are, for me, they're 9:30 from 9:30 to 12:30 in the morning. We meet once a week via Zoom, but in Namibia it's 3:30 to 6:30 in the afternoon. So every time we get together, I say good morning and they say good afternoon. So that's one of the differences. You don't think about time zones in general, but it becomes a major, I don't want to say obstacle, but a major challenge when you're trying to negotiate across continents. So what my life is sort of like now? Well, it's very much like it was before I got back from Namibia. My Fulbright was originally for a year, and I was extended for another 7 months. So the first year that I was in Namibia, I taught a face-to-face educational technology course for graduating seniors who were going to be teachers. So these were pre-service teachers. This year, we did something a little bit different. I'm teaching 3 online master's courses. And the University of Namibia, just like universities in the US, are turning more to online to reach more people and to just broaden their access. I guess that's the way that you would say it. So what we did for this particular course is that when we had students to submit applications, we actually gave them an opportunity to talk about what their access was like, what kind of computers did they have, where they were living, did they have access to the internet. And so the people who are in our programs, we decided that they did not have access issues. So access would not be an issue for them to participate in this program. Fortunately, we did not have to deny anybody because they didn't have access, which was a good thing. So before the pandemic began and when I was in Namibia, I was teaching these 3 online master's courses in addition to my a couple of online courses here in the US. And this was just for this semester. Last year, I didn't teach any US courses. But I think what I would say about teaching these courses is that the way that I keep in touch with my students in Namibia is quite different than the way that I keep in touch with my students here in the US. In the US, we primarily use email. My courses were hosted in Blackboard. And so we basically used email. And when we met, we would meet probably once a month via Zoom. And that would be primarily for my students to give presentations. So that's how we used the technology and that's how we interacted. We also had a discussion board on Zoom that we used to facilitate our discussions. What we ended up doing in Namibia is that we used an app, a smartphone app called WhatsApp. And if you have traveled internationally, I think this is a very popular app. So students in Namibia, even though we were using Moodle as our learning management system, and even though all students had access to Moodle, they prefer to use WhatsApp. And what I've found is that we don't use email at all. So if students want to ask me something, it's a WhatsApp message. And WhatsApp is a little bit like a text messaging system. And the reason students like it so much because in their environment, the telephone providers or the service providers give you free data for WhatsApp. And so that's one reason it's such a popular app. That's also the way that I keep in touch with my faculty back at the University of Namibia. They have a faculty group on WhatsApp. And so that becomes our primary means of connection. And so I guess my big thing is that my experience in the US and in Namibia, even though in some circles, Namibia is considered a developing country, depending on how you define developing, it is a developing country according to the national standards, is that the similarities that we have in terms of access issues across the population. And hopefully I'll get to speak more to that later.
Yeah, that was really great. Thank you for sharing. And it is kind of interesting that I think each country and each individual will have a different experience with what platforms they need to use and how they really impact, the way that communications happens, and therefore teaching and learning then happens as well. But it's great that you continue to be involved, and we thank you for that, making the best out of an interesting situation.
Yes.
So Jane, do you want to go next?
Sure. So my grant did not get cut short. I was always planning to return mid-February, and so I'm grateful that I was able to wrap things up and put things in place before the pandemic shut things down, though I'm a bit sad that I'm not going back in June like I had planned to. I'm supposed to be giving a talk at a national conference, an international conference at my host institution, but that's now moved online, as with everything else, right? So my typical days are spent with lots of Zoom meetings because, as was noted in the introduction, I support future English teachers. And so I had student teachers out in field placements when New York schools shut everything down. And there have been lots of meetings trying to figure out how to negotiate placement requirements, how to get our students ready for certification exams, what sorts of allowances will be made. And so there's been Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting with my local job. I also, since I wasn't coming back before the start of the semester, I wasn't teaching at the University of Rochester this semester. So I didn't have to experience that rapid switch to remote instruction in the crisis, but I am supporting faculty in their switches as a part of my role in Center for the Learning in the Digital Age. In terms of Indonesia, my Fulbright story is one that started way back in 2012 when Puja Studi, who was my advisee at that time, had her own Fulbright grant to come to the University of Rochester from Indonesia. And she was my student. And when she graduated, we made a commitment that we would once again see each other sometime. And so she became my host, and I got there in September, and we worked together to collect survey responses from kiddos in grades 6 through 12 about their use of technology. And I gave, 20 or so talks all around Indonesia and in the region while I was there, oftentimes having to convince people about the need to pay attention to what's happening in technology and what's happening and how technologies could be used for learning. I don't need to convince anyone anymore, right? They are all rapidly moving to online instruction in this crisis as well. And so also using WhatsApp, and also Instagram is very popular in Indonesia. So using those two platforms, I've been able to maintain connection with my colleagues back there. Puji and I have already submitted our first article draft based on our experience together. We're preparing for a virtual conference that's happening in Australia this summer. We are staying in touch through WhatsApp. We have a weekly writing session with other lecturers at the university that I was hosted by in Indonesia. And so highly connected and trying to straddle both worlds, and technology is the way that I do it.
That's really great. And it's great to sort of hear about how it seems like some of the conversations have shifted because of this pandemic, right? Things that you used to have to convince people of are becoming completely, normalized at this point. And, part of the question is, where do we go from here? And what becomes the new normal? So thank you for sharing. And I think we may get a little bit more into that in a bit. Let me pass it over to Patrice. Oh, and I think you're muted.
Yeah, you're still muted.
Oh, you're still muted. Uh-oh, I'm not going to be able to fix this IT problem right now. Let's see. Can
Mine
you,
says unmuted. Can you
beautiful. You're
hear me now?
definitely unmuted now. That's what I was talking about, that moment earlier of just like anticipation, hoping it's all going to work out. I'm glad we all got to experience that together.
Thanks, thanks. So my days are much like everyone else's, figuring out how to balance this new normal and kind of feeling like at times that it's under control and at times that my life is a complete and total situational comedy that is being lived out on Zoom and WebEx. And we have 3 family members. My husband is also a professor and my son is 20 years old, home from Tulane University, and we are all doing online teaching and learning in different corners of our home. So prior to COVID, I was actually standing in line in Houston to head back to Nepal, which was my Fulbright site, to spend time with groups of people and organizations in higher education and high schools, and with Empower Nepali Girls to do work that I love there, and had planned on going back for a few months of work when my flight was canceled while I was at the airport in Houston, and that trip came to a very abrupt halt, very sadly. So I am longing for Nepal and the people that I learned to love when I was there during that time. At the same time, life has gotten extremely busy with opportunities that I could not have imagined. So in addition to getting ready to teach courses online this summer at the university I teach at for psychology, both undergraduate and graduate, I've had time to work with a faculty research group, and we immediately jumped into a COVID study looking at anxiety and resilience of both teachers and students within the first 2 weeks that we all had to transition. And that has been extremely interesting to see what is coming out of that. We're just now running that data and working at getting that written up to publish. We have also been moving back to our connections in Nepal and helping with some, as a family, we've taken on a project for public service announcements regarding safety during COVID-19, and are sharing those with the organizations that we have connections with in Nepal to help people that don't have as much access stay safe during this time. So life has been continues to be an adventure and a sense of balance and getting used to this new normal, just like what everyone is doing.
I'm always happy to. I actually wrote down the quote about my life is a comedy that's played out on WebEx and Zoom and everything, because that's, I think, epitomizes how a lot of parents and working professionals feel about that. That's great. But more so, I think the inspiring stuff about the connections with Nepal and continuing to, take on a family project is something that, you guys are passionate about is one of the things too, that I think those type of stories really give people hope during this time. And I think that's great. Thank you for sharing. Let's move on to Tammy.
So it looks a little different for me. I'm in Manteca, California, 75 miles east of San Francisco. We're actually one of the first districts to go one-to-one in the state of California. And so our students from K to 12 have had one-to-one devices for about 6 years. So very proud of my district that we have been cultivating that type of culture. Of course, not a lot of teachers were using, we're a Microsoft district, so we are using Teams currently. But I was very fortunate in that our students have the technology and have training in OneNote and in PowerPoint and that sort of thing. My typical day before this was creating lesson plans in PowerPoint, which I would project up on the screen so students could see what book they were supposed to be in, what pages they were supposed to do, and doing the typical things that any 5th grade classroom teacher at a Title I school would do. When this all happened, the district, Manteca Unified, reached out to 3 teachers, myself included, and we kind of became teacher trainers. I do a lot of professional development on the side for NCCE. So we had our first online training in a Microsoft Live Teams event. I helped train 1,400 teachers at one time for I think it was a 90-minute session on Teams. And so it's been a wonderful learning curve for our teachers. What I did, since I already was creating my lessons in PowerPoint, was I started narrating them adding audio, adding video, adding digital inking with my explanations so I could explain math, because I realized that I had a lot of families that wouldn't be able to access my lessons during a typical school day. So I made sure that the lessons were recorded, uploaded to Stream, which is Microsoft's YouTube, so students could access those. And then, of course, we've had weekly meetups of whole class. I have individual meetings. They're grouped into small learning groups, so we can have small live meetings for that. And since we're Microsoft District, I also have Teams on my smartphone, which has meant that I am accessing that most hours of the day and at night. I've discovered students are accessing the lessons. Sometimes I get a message at 10 o'clock at night. How do I do this? And I've really tried to be accessible to them for that. So my typical workday now is, as we were talking about time zones, getting up really early, and I've done trainings virtually in New Mexico, New York, Wichita, Washington, and then 8, 9 o'clock, get online and start working with my students and other teachers in my district on Teams. It's a long day. I think most educators would agree. We're working a lot harder right now, but we're working smarter too. So that's what my typical day looks like.
That's great. And on behalf of parents, thank you for doing that. I may be one of those parents that does message the teacher late at night when we have a question. We don't expect an answer right away though. So, but I feel like it's an interesting world, because you, just to clarify, before the pandemic, you were actually physically in the classroom all the time, right? It wasn't.
Oh, absolutely, physically in the classroom and doing projects with my friends in Kolkata, the teachers there. We were sharing through online PowerPoint and Sway. We were sharing presentations on floristic provinces and that sort of thing with classes, and doing Skypes with each other. So, they're not in the classroom now either. So we're still chatting with each other through Facebook, email, and of course WhatsApp. So
that's great. That's it's fantastic to continue to we have the technology in order to be connected. And sometimes I think of what would have happened, 3 years ago, 10 years ago, 50 years ago, something like this. It'd be a completely different situation. But thank you for sharing. And James, let's go to you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm speaking to you from Sydney, Australia, where it's 2:30 a.m. in the morning. And that kind of, I was 10 months into a 12-month Fulbright, and I came home. I was going to spend an extra 2 months fulfilling a dream and doing a big road trip around America, but I had to cancel that. So I got home. I got the last flight out of Dallas, which was a bit exciting, but kind of strange being this giant airport. So I continued to teach. My Fulbright was at the University of Wyoming, so I continued to teach at the University of Wyoming when I got here. So similar to Angela, I was getting up at 5 a.m. to run a 6 a.m. class, which was 3 p.m. the day before in Wyoming. So I was not only time zone, but I was all freaked out about the days and had wishing people happy birthdays 2 days late and stuff like that. The big challenge for me was that I was running seminar classes in Wyoming, and I specifically like to confront really confrontational topics. And when you're in a room together, it's kind of easy to set ground rules and sort of have that interaction. So then the challenge was, okay, well, how do I take some of that kind of that kind of ability to talk about controversial things and continue that conversation online? And there were some elements that made it much harder. Other elements made it a little easier. But that was one big challenge. So going from, I suppose, 7 degrees in Wyoming and 105 degrees in Australia overnight was also a bit strange. But then trying to have that relationship with the students, that was one thing. Since being back in Australia, what I've simultaneously done was, even though I wasn't due back to my university in Sydney until August, I essentially spoke to the president, and I volunteered to come back because I knew that people would be stressed and so on. And so while here, I've been, while still teaching in Wyoming, I've been here supporting staff who are going online volunteer to do marking, and specifically have set up a number of programs for our PhD research students. And they're feeling incredibly vulnerable at the moment because their field work's been thrown out and so on. And so I'm organising sort of regular catch-ups with the entire PhD cohort of the university. And I suppose that the third thing is I've continued to try and keep my research going, and so I do research partisanship in contemporary democracies, and so trying to research some of that from Australia, looking at the US and other countries, has been a bit hard. But it's also I've got enough really great connections that I can continue to do that, and that's been really interesting to continue that. And I suppose finally, one of the things I'm lucky enough to do at the university is think about, well, this is really changed the way that we do business, the way that we operate. So what do we want to hold on to if we go back to the new normal? What is it that we've learned here that we should hold on to, and what else? And what should we? What can go back to how it was, but what should we learn and say, okay, this has been really great. So there's been these amazing innovations. How do we hold on to those and keep that spirit going even after things begin to settle down quite a bit?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's first of all, it's congratulations for being up at 2:30 in the morning. I feel like that may be a
Coffee.
tactic that I start sometime soon, because I imagine that's would be one of the quieter times in my house. There aren't 5 devices going with people connecting with whoever, but that's one of my colleagues texted me during this and said, that guy has commitment to this panel like I've never seen. It makes me feel a bit weak, but good for you. I think that the big question of what do we do next, or what is the new normal, is something that we're definitely going to be getting into that as we answer questions and later. But it's the question that I keep grappling with myself. And I think school districts in the United States and education policymakers and everyone is really thinking, not that you don't want to let a good pandemic go to waste, but there are things that are happening right now that are innovative and amazing, that do really allow us to connect and continue the important work that we're doing. And there are some pitfalls as well with who has access to that work and how hard and at what cost. And do you have to work every moment you're awake just because someone has your cell phone number? But I did want to pick up on one thing from that we were just talking about, which is you guys are providing educational opportunities for students on the other side of a screen. And that's very different than standing in front of a class for a number of reasons. I wanted to ask a couple of you, and maybe some more of you will want to jump on to this question, but I wanted to ask James, if you don't mind, to keep the mic for a second and just answer the question of what are some of the common challenges that you're facing with this remote access teaching, and from your learners and from maybe the technology itself, and also what kind of tips or tricks or ideas have you instituted in order to overcome some of those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's the pragmatic challenges that you spoke about, things going wrong and tough like that. But I suppose because I sort of do a lot of teaching in these controversial topics, the biggest challenge is to ensure that students continue to feel supported when we're confronting more controversial areas. So one of the big things that I've looked at is how we've lost, how often people lose their ability to disagree and to move forward. So how do you get people with diametrically opposite of views and bring them together and then have these conversations? And it's much harder to do that online. So creating a supportive environment is one of the big challenges. The other thing, the other challenge for me is that what I do in my what I often do in my classrooms, I often create a choose your own adventure scenario. So what I might do is say, okay, these are the pre-designed assessments, but what you can always do is come to me with an alternative model. So I've got, in one of my classes in Wyoming, I had this really amazing student who is a dancer, and she was like, hey, I want to make a video and talk about dance in terms of citizenship and how it can bring people together. And when you're in a I suppose a more personalized environment, you can sit down, you can work through how that will work. And so that flexibility is much harder online because you sometimes it's hard to visualize what people are doing. But the way that I suppose the way that you can confront that is by creating an environment where you can talk, where I suppose talking to people before class, during class, and after class is really important. So, knowing who's going to, like, trying to stay on top of who's doing what, how they're doing it, and then sort of making time, like giving them time, giving them moments where you can sort of connect with them and say, okay, I know you're working on this, how's it going? I know you can't do it this way, how about we do it that way? So trying to work with people to be creative. And I think what that can do is that can give people a sense of certainty. And I think that's, we're living in that sense of uncertainty is really sort of confronting us at the moment, especially with students that are about to graduate. And so anything you can do to give that sense of certainty to our students, I think is really, really valuable.
I think that is important, and I think it's interesting. You're talking about this, dealing with students who are, or learners who are, in their 20s or whatever, older, university level. Tammy, what about you with your slightly younger learners?
Yes, slightly younger, K-12. So for me, the biggest challenge is access. Yeah, can the students access the internet? Do they have good access to curriculum? And can they access their teacher? And if all of those are in place, how do I get the students to access all of that, right? So it's all about making the learning experience accessible remotely, and yet bringing some sense of normalcy to the students. So from our perspective in our district, we have been recording PowerPoints because we use that a lot in classrooms. And we always have morning announcements. So I have created a playlist on YouTube of morning announcements, if you will, that go out to families and students, both on Remind, if they follow the YouTube channel, and in our teams. And then making sure that students are accountable. That's another challenge. So making those phone calls to home and making sure the kids are okay. And do you need access to internet? Do you need food? We've got a grab and go program.
Wow.
But as we've heard so many times, really it's all about relationships. And it's about making sure that those relationships are good, not just between student and teacher, but between teacher and parent, and between parent and student. So for us, communication is the biggest thing. I can provide all of these great curriculum and recorded lessons, but if I don't have a family member making sure that the student has accessed that and turned in assignments, we lose that. And so for us to create that, that's my best tip, I guess, is relationships. Make sure students can access it, make sure that they know that you care, and make sure that you have really good communication with families. Beginning of the year, I always give a refrigerator magnet to my families when they come to back to school night, and it's got my email, my Twitter handle, my Teams, my Google Voice, every single way they can get a hold of me, because that's what it's about. If we're a team, all three of us are working together, student, family, and teacher. And so that's the biggest thing. We've got to work together. And if we work together, it's going to work.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it's it's interesting. There are different groups of learners, but it's sort of the same message and the same challenge in some ways. It's increasing, communication so that people can understand, what you're teaching, but also that you're there and that you're on their side and their team. Jane, I was wondering, from your point of view, as someone who's sort of taught this and thought through this at a I don't say a higher level, but at a theoretical level, if you will, what do you have to say about this?
In terms, I want to pick up on Tammy's thread of access and this divide that happens. So we know from the research that there is a digital divide between the haves and have-nots, and there are all these promises that theories make about what technology can do. But if people not only don't have the actual technological access, but Tammy hits on this notion of just understanding the content and seeing value in connecting via that content and learning in that content is another divide. So if young people don't have mentors that they see, don't have reason to want to take up the identity of somebody who uses technology in these ways and sees it as valuable, then they might resist it. And we saw that a bit in our data in Indonesia, that all of the cultural understandings about technology as a potential dangerous place as a source of hoaxes, as a source of other kind of divisive potentiality is a problem. So I'm really interested also in James's work and this idea of democracies and confrontational issues, and how we engage with controversial issues in these online spaces, and help students feel safe and help teachers feel safe kind of doing this. I also saw this from the student teacher perspective, like I said earlier. So many of my students, my student teachers, had their placements interrupted, and some had done enough that it was okay. We didn't need them to keep going on. But I had one gentleman who needed to keep accumulating experience and demonstrating that he could do it. And he had to teach online through Google Classroom, and that shift was a challenge for everybody. He's in an urban setting, and yet he was able to celebrate when 12 of his secondary students actually submitted written work in the midst of a pandemic. And so the numbers in terms of access and what people are able to have the bandwidth to access and attend to school is another real challenge in many of our communities, and that crosses the globe.
Yeah, and that was a great segue. I was going to ask Angela to jump in and talk about how this does cross the globe as you're continuing to connect with folks in Namibia and in your professional experience here as well. Oh, Angela, you're muted.
I just want to express some gratitude for the teachers and the students who have embraced this challenge. In some ways, I am very surprised that people are surprised that this wouldn't work perfectly. I'm surprised that people are surprised that everybody doesn't have access. And I say this from the US perspective and from the perspective in Namibia. Both countries decided that we were going to do our higher education and our K-12 learning using e-learning. And you can look at both those countries and say, how did you come to that conclusion exactly? I was talking to one of my Namibian students, and my master's students in Namibia are K-12 teachers, and they don't call it K-12, but that's what we would call it. And so she was very excited about an application that she was doing on WhatsApp that her students were very much engaged in. So she was telling us about it. So the question that I asked her was, how many students are enrolled in your class? She gave me a number. How many students participated in this activity? She gave me another number that was probably less than half of the students who were enrolled in the classroom. So what does it say? And that becomes the big thing. It could work for the people for whom it will work. It's not going to work for the people who are totally excluded. And so in Namibia, one of the things that we did, in one of my courses, my students had a final project. We changed that final project. So that final project became for each of them to develop a proposal for what emergency remote teaching looks like in their area. Not that everybody is going to do. I mean, if you're out in a rural area where the big thing is we don't even have electricity, to say you're going to do e-learning is probably not realistic. And so what it does is giving my students an opportunity to think through where they are, because the answer is not always online learning. It can't always be. The answer has to be, how do I reach my students where they are? So that's one level of access. The other level of access and the challenge that we're finding is that we're asking teachers to teach online who know less about online than the students that they're teaching online. And so it's almost like we thought this was going to happen by magic. Oh, we'll give you one extra week and now you can turn your course online. I don't know what we were thinking. And I think that what happens when you get desperate, you come up with desperate solutions. I do commend us in the US, and it's not a perfect solution, for saying that students can do pass fail, for saying that I don't know what I'm going to do about marking this work. These are things that we had to do. So where I think that we are is, I think what we've shown, and Tammy was talking about it, her group was prepared. Other groups weren't prepared. And it's reasonable to expect different outcomes from people who are prepared and people who aren't prepared. So the question I think for us becomes, what do we do now? How do we make realistic moves? So I don't know what teachers are doing this summer to prepare for a fall if we end up online in the fall. But if they aren't preparing for that, we're going to be in the same place that we are now. If our administrators aren't preparing for that, if our infrastructure is not preparing for that. So I don't know, you can't just stop the clock and say, give me time to plan, but you have to find some time to plan. And I don't know, I think that's the big challenge. Did I forget the question?
No.
You know what?
Angela,
I think you
I'd
got
like
it right.
I would like to jump into that for just a moment to say that when when the question was what we have observed in our students, and one of the things I'm noting is an abundance of resilience, but there is also an abundance of anxiety with our students, and particularly with our students that have that digital divide or that socioeconomic divide, regardless of what part of the world they're in. And so we have students here in rural Louisiana that are sitting in Walmart parking lots with their families, trying to do their coursework to maintain. So one of the things that I just wanted to touch on was, this morning the Washington Post reported that a third of Americans are now showing signs of clinical depression and anxiety. And the most recent Best College survey shows 81% of college student age, young adults, 81% are saying that they are feeling anxiety to the level that they are having trouble functioning at times. And so I think as, we're feeling that anxiety about their access, about their sense of their futures, kind of what's happening as their internships are falling apart this summer and they don't know what's coming in the fall. They can't picture what things are going to look like or where their life is headed. And they don't see how to have social lives. They're trying to abide by rules, but like, how do you date? How do you have friends? How do you maintain a life? And so we know that call centers are getting more calls than ever. Suicide lines are getting more calls than ever. And we are being told by all the research that we are going to have a mental health wave following COVID for a while. So not to be Debbie Downer, but to say we need to be prepared for that as well. But I think as educators, we have a role in that. And that is in taking the time for those preventative measures that don't take that much to do that make such a huge impact. So taking the time in a class to build in assignments that allow students a chance to talk about how they feel during this and to process this situation from their perspectives or from whatever area you teach in is really important to give them a sounding board, even academically, as we can. It's also really important to keep your expectations high. The students need the challenge right now. We all know what parts of our day feel like when we can't figure out what to do with ourselves, and we're kind of feeling that lack of purpose at moments because our life isn't what it was, and we're all trying to kind of adjust to the life we have versus the life we thought we were going to have at this point, whatever that is. And I think it's really important we keep our expectations high and we provide the support that's needed and we listen carefully and provide resources to students, counseling lines, opportunities for free counseling that are still available through their schools. There are free things that are happening now that are like quarantine chat. That's a free available way to connect and make new friends during a time of quarantine safely all over the world through your phone. And so there are options. I suggest we gather resources for our students as well and help them navigate this period of time. There are lessons that are just as important as the academic curriculum to be taught.
Yeah, I think that's really a very important point too. We've got, I like a couple of the things that you especially said, which is, you've done, part of it is to not to lower your expectations necessarily on the education that's being delivered and like the students getting the high marks or whatever. You still need to maintain an excellence or keeping people learning and all this sort of stuff. But how do you do that in a situation in which everyone is stressed and facing very different, even within the same districts, there are huge disparities. See how they, how they react to it. And I think Tammy, you wanted to jump in and talk.
Yeah, I was just thinking that I love what Patrice was talking about, because we have to be adaptable. When we first started in our district, a lot of teachers were saying, how can I recreate the classroom experience? And it's a brand new experience, and the way the kids are experiencing how they get curriculum. So we've had to look at it as a brand new school year, a brand new classroom, and what are the procedures, what are the rules, and then take a look at how the kids are doing. We have to be adaptable. I agree. Kids absolutely need to have that communication with each other. We use Microsoft Teams, where kids can reach out and video chat with each other at any time, or chat with the teacher. It's very easy. But I've had students who have reached out to me and said, can you post the lessons like at 6 or 5 o'clock in the morning, because I'm childcare for my family and I need to do them early because I got to start at 8 o'clock, with my brothers and sisters. So it's like, yes, absolutely, I can do that. I have to be adaptable to make it accessible for them. And I just yesterday, I was meeting with my students, and this Friday is our last day of school. And one of them said, can we still have meetings when school is out? And of course we can. So even though school's out, I'm still going to be going on to Teams and having meetups, and I'm reading books. I'm recording, me reading books out loud to them, and because they need that normalcy, and they need that sense of, it's going to be okay. We have to think about them. So we as educators must be adaptable in the way that we teach.
Yeah, I think
Can
you're absolutely. Oh, James, go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, just two things. I think, yeah, one of the really great things that Patrice said is the complexity of access. So access isn't just bandwidth, but it's having a room to study in. It's having the ability to turn on your video to connect with you. So, allowing some of the students who don't want to turn the video on because they might not feel comfortable inviting you into their house. I think that's understanding that. That's, I think, really important, that access means multiple things. But the second thing is that flexibility, Tammy, and I so agree, and one of the things that I also recognize is, so what I do is I pre-record part of my class. I then, which is like just a video of me talking, then I record a PowerPoint, then I also do live stuff. And so it's kind of also thought about, well, then how do I deliver for these different cohorts, and like you said, people that have got care responsibilities, people who might, their parents might be off, so all of a sudden they've got to care for their younger brothers and sisters and things like that. And I think that's also important. And I think, I can't remember who said it, but I think, Jane, you were saying it, and so you're saying it about supporting our faculty as well, because all of a sudden they're kind of going, whoa, like, how do I'm used to just going into a classroom and delivering what I've got to do for an hour, then walking out. But now I'm jumping into people's rooms, I'm inviting people into my rooms and all that. And that's why I think it's that those twin challenges that we need to do is think about how do we make this accessible in multiple ways, but then also how we assist our faculty who are also really struggling. And Angela said, you just can't click your fingers and say everything's going to be great. It's going to take time, and being able to support our faculty as well is so important.
I think that's a really, really great point as well. I mean, it's funny that, we talked about the stresses that students are facing, stresses that faculty are facing, and then, there's the rest of the world that isn't involved currently in education directly, but they're the parents who are trying to help, or maybe the grandparents or the siblings, in that case. There is also, this entire group of people now who maybe don't have children, aren't involved in education, who are thinking about, taking a course online. So, I think there are these notions of what education is today are really shifting, and we're watching them shift. James, I was wondering, you talked a lot about the differing, platforms and things like that in adult learning. What, what types of platforms or what types of stories are you hearing about, the everyday kind of person who's maybe has tons of time because of the coronavirus? Like, I know that there are those people out there. I hear about them on the radio and TV and things, who put down their sourdough starter for a little bit and thought that maybe they're going to start, taking an online course. My first question is, what do you say to those kind of people, and what platforms are really taking off or show promise that maybe can be applicable to the regular K-12 and university classrooms. Maybe they're the same. And then the second part, I'm going to pass it over to someone else, and I'm going to ask, what about the parents and these support givers? What should they be doing and thinking about? But James, let's start with you on the adult learning piece.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that the Australian federal government did, which was, I think, really positive, was they offered incentives for universities to offer a whole bunch of programs, especially to those who had been negatively impacted by the virus, like lost work, and so universities are all across Australia started developing some really great programs for for people to skill up, and those being recognised with credit. And so there's been some, there's been, I suppose, some platforms that are pretty much ready to chop and slice and turn them into a shorter online program, and others have been built up from the ground up. I suppose what's distinguished the really good ones from the ones that are pretty average when we're talking about platforms is when people just start thinking, oh, well, I'm going to take what I do face to face and just throw it online. That doesn't work. It's a different pedagogical environment. You need to think about it, and that's, I think, been one of the really important ways that we've had to reimagine how to deliver things. It's a different set of skills. So I think that's been one of the really one of the ways that sort of, I suppose, different universities or different colleges have been able to distinguish themselves is about thinking it through. I suppose the second thing that some of the really other really good stories that we do get is those who, and again, we've all talked about this in different ways, is for those who can build sort of a sense of community and connection rather than just making people feel that they're on their own and they're just kind of recipients of information. I think that's one of the things, Vincent, that where people are feeling a little bit overwhelmed. There's all this information coming at them. Just knowing what COVID means or coronavirus, just getting your head around this stuff is so crazy at the moment that when you're throwing things at people, you've got to be, I think, cognizant of the fact that they can only take so much. So where you can create a community of learning or a community of practice, that's what I think has been the most powerful ones. And I think in some ways, once you get that right, then there are so many powerful online tools that you can use, but they're secondary. First get the pedagogy, first get the practice right, and then the tools fall into place pretty quickly.
I would say here's where, my research on interest-driven learning and these kind of informal learning environments might be able to come in. And this is what I, long before COVID, have been trying to encourage with the educators that I worked with. So in terms of access, like technology has broken down the barriers that used to exist between professionals and amateurs or people with just an interest, right? You mentioned the sourdough starter phenomenon, and there's online communities now. If you want to learn how to bake the best sourdough bread, they will help you with this. But we also have access to professionals. So through things like Masterclass, if I wanted to, I could learn about scientific thinking from Neil deGrasse Tyson, right? I could learn how to write for television from Shonda Rhimes. How awesome is that? Again, if I can afford both resource-wise, but also have access. So there's these kind of breaking down barriers between professional and amateur, but then there are these more informal spaces that crop up in online communities where everybody gets to have a voice, and you can go to Reddit or you can go to YouTube and support each other's learning about anything that you want to learn about.
Yeah, there are a lot of, a plethora of options these days for people to go and kind of learn about whatever they do want to learn about. Let me shift over to the second part of the original question, though, which is about parents, who are, in a lot of ways, back in the good old days, parents used to be the primary drivers of education. People would learn from them at home, and they grew up based on kind of all that. We're in a position in which we're really very important now, and I don't think a lot of us signed up to be teachers. So Angela, do you have anything that you'd like to share about maybe the role of parents and how they can engage? I think it was interesting that you were talking earlier about how there are access issues and equity issues, And parents all across the country and all across the world really want the same thing for their kids, right? To be able to get the education. So what can they do?
Well, and I think that this question becomes a multifaceted question as well, because just like we have students who are in different places, we have parents who are in different places. We have parents, and I'm not saying this negatively, but we have some parents who are able to help their students substantively. We have other parents who are just more able to provide moral support. And that moral support is very important, but they don't have the tools to provide that content sort of report. Lord knows a lot of us can't teach math because they don't teach math the way I learned math. And so I think for parents, it also becomes a notion of how do I find the right resources to help my students? When we were in Namibia, one thing that my husband ended up doing was we had a housekeeper, and that's because in Namibia, the housekeeper comes with the house. And so the housekeeper said her daughter was having trouble with math, and she didn't know how to help the daughter with math. My husband said, I'm good at math. So she brought the little girl, teenager, to work with her one day. And what my husband said was, I need to know where you are and where your questions are. And so she doesn't have a computer at home. All they have is a cell phone. So he put the computer on the kitchen table. He took her to the website where she could look at the videos on algebra. She didn't ask him one question because her questions were answered from that resource he was able to provide for her. So even he didn't have to have the knowledge, because whatever that resource was, that knowledge was in the resource. So I think we need to figure out how we can make our parents resourced. Does that make a difference? Does that make sense? And what that means, it goes back to this preparation. If I want my teachers to be resourced, if I want my parents to be resourced, I, as the teacher, probably need to give them some resources to help their students with. But if I just found out yesterday that I'm going to have to teach this online, 9 times out of 10, I'm not going to have time to find the resources because I'm trying to find the resources for myself. And so a part of this whole e-learning design component is, how do I design the content for my students, and how do I design those necessary supporting materials? And it just takes time. So I don't beat a dead horse. I'm just going to leave that there. Our parents need to know that there are resources that can help them that aren't within them.
Yeah, I think one thing that you said that was really, you really hit the nail on the head, was this idea of meeting people where they are. There's a lot of people in the United States, within the same neighborhoods even, and across the country and the world, that are in very different, situations and are coming at this from very different angles. And I think one thing about the Fulbright program is that what we're sort of hoping to do is to help everybody, go to another country, connect with people that are very different than you, and have some sort of a shared sense of empathy and a shared experience, so that when you go back, hopefully after your entire grant, if there's not a pandemic that gets in your way, you do continue, and we've seen with you guys that you continue to have these online conversations and these conversations with people that you've met. So I'm going to ask one question, just go down the line, and then I'm going to turn it over, I think, to Kate, who might come in with some questions from our audience this time. The question that I have, if you could just briefly answer, so how did your Fulbright experience prepare you for this? And I know that you all weren't sitting wherever you were on your Fulbright thinking someday there's going to be a pandemic and I'm going to be doing all this online. But I think that there are some common traits maybe that we have in our grants, in our grant experiences that do share. So Patrice, do you want to start?
Sure. So I think the Fulbright prepared me in terms of expecting the unexpected, being able to move on my feet and look for resources, trying to match my expectations with the resources that were actually available, and kind of starting to understand that sometimes the latest thing out and all the possibilities that were there weren't necessarily the answer, that sometimes the answer was in the relationship I was building more than any given platform or technology tool or supply that I might need. That what was more important is that I shared a sense of normalcy with the people that I was working with, in terms of us all trying to figure out together what our common goal was and the best way to get to that, given what we had to work with. And I just find that that is so much the position that I find myself in many days now, trying to figure out what it is that I need to accomplish. What is it that isn't necessarily meeting my need the most as an educator or as a parent, but my child's need or my students' needs, and what is reasonable to work with, that it's not a competition, and that if I'm caring and wanting to get it right, I'm already winning, and my students are already winning, and my child is already winning if I'm worrying about it, and I'm using the things that I can find to the best of my ability to give them a positive experience.
Great. James?
Yeah, I suppose, you know, I'm the first member of my family to go to university. Mum ironed for a living and Dad carried bricks for a living. And I suppose what the Fulbright experience gave me is to understand that all systems have similar challenges in some ways. You know, a cross section of students and really trying to navigate a system that sometimes I don't understand. And I suppose as we've shifted online, you know, I think one of the big challenges that we need to teach, especially freshmen, is, you know, when they come to universities, to learn the culture of learning that we expect from them. And I suppose it was just thinking to myself, well, how do I promote that culture of learning from a face-to-face environment to an online environment where we're surrounded by this crazy pandemic?
That's great. Jane?
So we were talking before we got started about all of the various ways that our Fulbright experience prepared us for pandemic life, and materially that we got used to not having the things we're used to being available to us, right? And so we got a little bit more comfortable with that. We're not freaking out because we can't get our exact brand of toilet paper or whatever it may be, right? But I go back to the words of my very wise host, Puji, who picked me up at the airport in Samarang at the beginning of my grant and said to me, patience and flexibility. Patience and flexibility. And she said, if you have those things when you're here in Indonesia, you will do fine. And every once in a while, we'd have a conversation where I'd pull her aside and go, yeah, this is one of those moments for patience and flexibility right here. Because what the Fulbright gave me an opportunity to do is anytime I felt uncomfortable, anytime things were happening at the university or in a school in a way that I was like, why are they doing that? Instead of being judgmental, I just got curious. Why does this make sense to them? Why is this necessary? And what can I learn from this? And going back to like, how can I meet them wherever they are? And so it just made me so much more adaptable. I also got really good at using tools to connect with people. I spent 6 months on Zoom and WhatsApp and FaceTime talking to people at all hours of the day to stay connected. So Zoom happy hours are no big deal, and supporting my doctoral students and attending a dissertation defense and making new doctors through Zoom, no big deal. Now everybody else is catching up.
Yeah, Fulbright is at the cutting edge. Tammy, what about you?
Oh, wow. I have my master's in STEM, so educational technology has been just a natural for me for years. So I'm a Skype master teacher, so I've been Skyping with people around the world for 10 years. But what Fulbright gave me was that attention to attentiveness, the need for listening and keeping my mouth closed and being attentive to what's happening around me and what other people need. When I taught in Kolkata, my host teachers were marvelous, but they were doing something that this techie girl was not used to, and that was they were having students write in journals. I mean, write with a pen and paper, and then they would write back to them, you know, and there would be this whole discussion. And I thought, wow, That's such a neat opportunity. So I started that with my students this year. I missed that, having their journals and having this conversation back and forth, but that's melded over into what we're doing now, because now I find when parents reach out to me on a Skype call and are having a problem, or a student needs some help, I'm listening, I'm paying attention. And I think that fosters empathy as well, because if you're listening and you care, and I love, Jane, you are so right, you learn to be flexible and patient, then you can meet the needs, and it's going to be okay because you care about each other.
That's great, thank you. And Angela, what about you?
One of the things, and it started with the Fulbright orientation that I went to in Evanston, I think, outside of Chicago. The thing that they said was, be flexible. Just because you wrote that proposal doesn't mean that when you get to the site, that proposal is what you're going to carry out. And that has carried me through my Fulbright experience. If I didn't remember anything else from that orientation, and I swear that's the best advice that we could have been given. And I think what it taught you, and everybody has said it, you don't judge because you understand that things change. So why would you judge? It's just different. You try to understand, but you don't judge. And what I think that what that has also done for me is it's allowed me to look at the US in a different way. You know what I mean? It's allowed me to, sometimes you think the US is so advanced. Well, some of us are so advanced, but then some of us aren't. And it makes me think how the world is the same. You know what I mean? We're all in this big pot and we're not that much different from each other. And so that sort of helped me make it through as well, because the people in Namibia aren't the other. This new environment that we're working in is not foreign. I don't know, just this whole notion of, hey, just because you wrote it in that proposal doesn't mean that's the way it's going to happen. And I think that's what's helped me even during this pandemic.
Well, that's that's great. And I was thinking back to earlier when I put in my little plug about applications are open. If you're not inspired after listening to this, and you haven't got a couple tips to put in your application of what Fulbright is looking for, and also what Fulbright alumni are such great examples of, I think you may have an unfair advantage if you do apply after watching this. So thank you guys. I'm going to turn it back to Kate because I just got a message saying, there's been some questions that have been previously submitted, and also we're getting a flood. Quote is, we're getting a flood of great questions. So Kate, I will allow you to turn on the spigot and I will get out of the way.
Thanks, Vincent. And yes, we have so many amazing questions, dozens. We will likely not be able to get to all of them, but after the webinar, if you'd like to reach out to us, I will share our email address in the chat. If you want to send in your question by email, we can also connect you with the panelists and they can follow up with you afterwards, specifically the questions about particular resources. I think that a lot of our panelists will have many resources that they would be happy to share with all of you. We've received a lot of questions about whether this webinar is recorded because people would like to rewatch it and share it with their colleagues. And it's really great to hear that. And yes, this webinar is being recorded and we will be posting it on our YouTube page early next week. But getting to some of the great questions that we got from you, and this one is really open to everyone. So you have all taught in countries all over the globe. What role does culture play in students and teachers' attitudes towards online learning? And if you have any specific examples to share from your Fulbright experiences, that would be great.
So I definitely have one. So we surveyed secondary students about their use of technology and what they thought about it. Again, months before COVID was a thing that any of us knew about. And Pooji and I got an overwhelming response from the students about hoaxes and a fear of hoaxes. And I think especially in our pandemic situation, when it came, and I've checked in with Pooji regularly since I left, when it came to needing to switch to online instruction, and in Indonesia, much like Namibia, everything happens with smartphones, or as they call it, handphones. So the idea that parents were going to watch their children use these devices for learning and try to support them for that and feel okay about that, people were very skeptical. The youth themselves were very skeptical. You know, they have this understanding that they need to worry about the information that comes to them from online sources, which is not a bad worry to have necessarily. But when you discount all of the information, it makes it hard to convince people that going to online instruction is a good thing to do. So their culture of kind of a little bit wariness, skepticism, fear base about technology was definitely a challenge that the Indonesian educators are working on trying to overcome as they go to online instruction.
Yeah, if I can just quickly add to that, yeah, I mean, I do a lot of work in Indonesia as well, and I know that often it's seen in some parts of the world that online education is secondary to face-to-face, and part of that's because I think sometimes people have produced terrible online materials and they haven't been very good at delivering it. So there is a bit of a track record there, but I think, yeah, there is in some places of the world there needs to be a cultural shift, and you know, like you said, Vincent, you can't waste a good, you know, this is too good of a chance for us to waste of the innovations that we've had. So yeah, I think it's a great chance to confront that and hopefully make it, you know, change it, which allows broader accessibility.
Yeah, and I've noticed some students are very wary about having their video turned on when we're having classroom meetings. That's a cultural thing at times. Sometimes it's a personal preference, but I found, again, needing to be adaptable and saying it's okay that I don't see your face, but I need to talk to you. So that's what I've noticed a lot with these kinds of meetings where students are like, you know, here, look at my dog, or look out the window, or, you know, I'm going to put a big sticker over my face so you're not looking at me. And that's okay. I want them to be comfortable.
So we have a great question that's on a very different topic, but the pandemic raises the question of lack of accessibility for lots of types of students, but specifically for students with disabilities. The question is about, you know, are we sort of falling back into normalcy in its real meaning of inclusive perspective, or more inequalities? And if any of you have any particular tips for educators that are working with students with disabilities in terms of technologies or other you know, strategies to make learning more accessible.
Well, the one beautiful thing about technology is that we have so many translation apps and AI that make content available. We have families that speak Mandarin and Tagalog and Spanish, and I can use, for example, an immersive reader, and I can send instructions home so families can just tap an open immersive reader and have it read to them in their language. So that's one of the things that's been good for accessibility. And of course, that immersive reader is also good for students who have difficulties with transposing letters, you know, and that kind of thing. So I've been really happy with the translation so that I'm able to keep those lines of communication open for parents. And so that's one accessibility that I think technology really helps.
And I think most of your vendors who sell us these software products have thought about accessibility. So if you're a parent and you're at home, you can just do a little search in that little help box that says accessibility, and it'll begin to show you some of the features that are already built in. My students were surprised at the features that were built into the Office products, PowerPoint, Word, Excel, whatever. And so those things are there and they're readily accessible to us because other people have already thought about them. And I think that's a good place to start.
I would also say, in terms of an andragogical perspective, thinking about giving students more than one option for how to complete assignments. So knowing what your end goal is, but then allowing the students multiple avenues to reach that end goal, so that depending upon what kind of need they have, whether it's extra time or whether it's the, a visual disability or a physical disability of some kind, or even a mental health disability like anxiety that might overtake and slow down, that it provides them the option to choose a means that works best to them to show you the evidence of their learning. And I think that's really important and not a difficult thing to do.
And I would say, going back to our earlier discussion about how many Zoom meetings we all have now, in 40 minutes, my next Zoom meeting is one of my colleagues in disability studies is giving a professional development to the faculty in my school about what we need to do to our documents and to our presentations and to our materials in order for things like screen readers to work. Because yes, Angela's right that many of these technologies have built-in accessibility features for those with visual impairments or other hearing impairments, whatever it may be. But it's like a garbage in, garbage out kind of situation. If I don't realize how I need to format things, it's going to read gobbledygook to that person in a screen reader. So one of my colleagues has been trying to help us all think about how to make sure that our materials are accessible when they get uploaded to a learning management system.
And what the Microsoft products will do for you is after you create your product, you can submit it to an accessibility check. And it'll tell you, these are things that you need to change if you want this to be read by a screen reader. These are things that you need to do if some of your students have visual impairments. And so it will help you in that way. So it's not magic. It's not all that you'll need, but it's a place for you to get started.
Yeah, and we have to communicate that to families. So on our district website, we've got a link for parents and a whole environment for parents where they can go and read, how do I help my kid access this? How can I make the type bigger? How can I do this and that? So having that instruction available for families and students and teachers is very helpful.
So we've had a couple of really interesting questions come in from teachers in fields like agriculture and music, just seeing that digital education might be a bigger transition for some fields of study more than others. And so the question is, what can be done to the future of digital education for fields like animal agriculture when it comes to labs?
Yeah, look, this is one of the things that we're confronting at the moment with the university, because we're just introducing a bit of a staged return for parts of the university, or we're thinking about how we're going to do it. And so I suppose it's thinking about how do you, there are a lot of immersive tools out there, and learning, again, these can be quite expensive and they can chew up a lot of bandwidth. But what we've been doing is thinking, okay, well, things like we've got this amazing online nursing program, and if you need something that you really do need to be practice based is something like nursing. But what we found was we've been building this over the last few years, and it became really important during times of COVID to really speed up our nurses. Preparing our nurses to sort of be able to get out in the field faster, to act not as frontline staff but as supportive staff, and that's been really important. So a friend of mine who runs a sort of an engineering company said to me, the technology's there for any answer. What we lack is the imagination. And I think if we, it does require for people to sit around and speak to potential vendors or speak to other people doing interesting stuff, not always in your own field, talking to people that might be doing creative stuff in other areas, and looking and saying, well, in this short-term space, what is it that we can do and build that into long-term that makes us confront those those things that seemingly seem impossible to do online. And I reckon if you can do nursing online, you can definitely do most things you can find ways to do most things online.
And sometimes what people have found is that, if there are things that you think are critical that need to be done face to face, do you have to be the proctor? For example, in Namibia, there are regional, and I get every state probably has them, there are regional educational centers. So if there are some things that need to be, and I don't know what those things are, can those things be offloaded to those sites? Everybody doesn't have to go at the same time, and the same people don't have to be there at the same time. So that's the way a phlebotomist is somebody who takes blood. And that's the way they did it in Florida a few years back. They did most of their work online, but when they had to have a lab, they went to a local hospital or somewhere that the school had agreed with that you could work with. People are also having their students video themselves doing different tasks, but you got to be careful when you're working on somebody else. But so there are, I agree with James. If we had the time to think about it, we could come up with a reasonable and workable solution for the short term. But a lot of times we don't have that time.
Great. So we have another question about assessments. So the question is, how can we change our assessment tools and patterns for digital teaching? As this pandemic is teaching us that standardized testing may not necessarily be the best way to assess a child's talent. And this question is open to everyone.
Well, I think we've hit on some of that with the notion of giving options to students for how they might want to demonstrate learning, project-based learning, multimodal learning opportunities, portfolio type of work, work that shows evolution and revision and attention to standards more broadly, and less multiple choice, easily graded. Although if we do need to do those sorts of checks for understanding, technology makes that also super easy. Many of the Indonesian teachers that I talked to when I was there loved using Google Forms for quizzes, because then they could just get a spreadsheet and see all the answers. And for them, that was, you know, radically transformative because they didn't have to collect all the papers. So I think there are a variety of ways for us to think about assessment in a variety of different ways.
And I would add that in ways that actually provide a richness and levels of depth that we didn't have face-to-face at times. If we look for the gifts in this, there are some true gifts to be found. I'm finding I have a lab with graduate students where it's a performance-based class where we're teaching them critical incident skills. So lethality assessments and crisis management techniques that we absolutely have to know that for ethical reasons that students are on board with those things before we can let them start to see clients. It is very important that they show evidence of mastery of some of these critical things that they have to know before they start into the field and actually see clients. A lot of responsibility goes with that. So we're having to rethink. In the past, that has always been like 6 students who worked as a team and then had peer observers, and one student would see a client and have a peer observer, and I would also be watching, and it would be videoed, and then we would watch videos and process. We're having to rethink completely how to do that, and it's actually becoming quite the challenge. And our plan is to use Zoom rooms, breakout rooms on Zoom, where mics and things can be turned off, and people obviously have to have, you know, mics and videos will be turned off for everyone except the therapist and the client. The client absolutely has to be informed that they're being observed just like they were in the past, but it was in another room and they were being video recorded. Now we don't only have audio, we have video where we can see, we can provide feedback, and I can actually provide some live feedback during sessions to a young clinician that's just getting training. And we record the sessions and have them to view as a team by sharing a screen afterwards, and our team will be able to practice supervision that way through a team approach. It's possible to take things that at one time we thought we absolutely could not do in any way other than face-to-face, and we're seeing depths of real positives for looking at students' ability and the evidence of their learning and their performance, where we can actually watch them practicing the things that we expect them to be able to perform in their jobs.
So I'm going to move to our last question because we're going a little over time, but I think this is a really great one to wrap up on. And the question is, you know, it's great to be supportive and accessible, but as educators, we should not forget that we also have a family and personal lives and need to rest and so on. Do you have any recommendations, or just want to give a, you know, share your personal experiences with what you can do as a teacher to not overload or burn out?
Look, I'm just going to I'm going to jump in here quickly and then pass to the wonderful panel. Look, I actually have I try and manage it by having set times for breaks and things like that. So one of the things that I've loved about this shutdown process is I've learned to be a barbecue king. So every morning I cook the family a barbecue breakfast. So I'm learning to make omelets on that barbecue. I'm learning to do mushroom, you name it, I've got it. So when this is all over, you're all invited to my house, not, you know, for a barbecue in Sydney, Australia during summer. Come. And I think one of the things is, so I make a point, we have breakfast together at a certain time. I do make sure that I have regular breaks during the day and try and do some physical exercise. I'm trying to learn skills like juggling a soccer ball, which I've never done before in my life. So I'm watching lots of YouTube videos and learning how to do that. And also picking a time of the day where you have to finish because you can't burn out. Now, like Tammy, or like nights like tonight, where I'm going to get up at 1:30 in the, I'm going to go to sleep and get up at 1:30 in the morning to join you all. It means that I will be flexible about how I schedule those breaks. But look, the thing is, and this is, I can never say this enough, is we talk about sustainability, we have to practice sustainability. And you're no good to anyone if you're burnt out. No good to anyone, not good to your students, you're not good to your family, you're not good to yourself. So I would definitely book in everything from movie nights to date nights to barbecue nights.
And James, I would add to that to say two very simple things from a psychological perspective. Just remember that whole cognitive behavioral approach, which is to listen to that voice that's inside your head when things don't work like you plan for them to be, when you're not doing the things you plan to do this summer, when it is 10 o'clock and you're still sitting in that same chair and you haven't taken a break. What are you saying to yourself when it feels uncertain? When you are feeling anxiety or something, because the way you're thinking about all this newness will directly affect your emotions and therefore directly affect your behaviors and your resilience to deal with it. So listen to that, how you're talking to yourself. You know, we often are much harsher. Show yourself some grace in this process and some forgiveness, and take care of yourself in those ways. And the second thing is mindfulness. Take a moment out every day. It takes 2 seconds to stop and think about just being in the moment, in the present, and thinking about what you have instead of what we don't have. The things that are going on in that moment that are good in your life. Take a breath and think about what you have that's good. There's innumerable things, regardless of the situation we find ourselves in.
And Patrice, I totally agree. And I think sometimes you just got to share those moments as well, right? So I say to my students, hey crew, I'm really sorry, I'm a bit behind. I'm working across 2 time zones here. It's 18 hours ahead in Australia. I'm really confused. So, and people are generous if you're honest with them in that way as well.
I think we're teaching our students how to be adaptable, how to be flexible, and how to be human when we share a little of our anxiety appropriately with them, to say, I'm just learning this. I don't know how to do it. Help me, learn with me. We'll figure it out. We've got this.
And some things you don't have to figure out now. I would suggest keeping some type of journal, either whichever way you write best. I keep a journal in each of my Blackboard courses, and that's our learning management system. And the things that I record are, this is what I would do differently next time. This is what I need to add for next time. Because what you'll find yourself doing, especially when you're learning as you're going about online learning, you will be in a constant mode of churn, because you'll be figuring out, oh, I can do this. And so you're going to keep trying to do everything. And I think we have to give ourselves the freedom to say, this is what I have to do. This is what my students must have. This would be nice and I'm going to do this for next time, and this will help my students better. But we have to sort of give ourselves the freedom to separate what I have to do from what I would love to do because I know it will help. And to know that our students aren't, my thing is, I think my students are going to be traumatized for life if we don't do this. Well, probably not. And so if I can get myself down off that ledge, I can sort of judge between all these things that I'm thinking about.
Wonderful. If we don't have any more comments to share, Jane, did it look like you were going to jump in real quick?
I would just say, picking back up on what James says, that we need to normalize and verbalize boundary setting, and that's okay. That just because technology keeps us accessible 24/7 doesn't mean that the educators need to make themselves available 24/7. And whatever our schedules are, whatever our boundaries are, whenever our downtimes are, if we communicate that in advance to our students and they know a weekend is a weekend, even in a pandemic, whatever it may be, and I won't be checking email, then that lowers their anxiety. If we don't know and people think that technology keeps us always connected, and we haven't verbalized expectations or our boundaries, then that's the anxiety production.
Yeah, and the one thing that I'm hopeful for about how things are going is that we understand that teachers are necessary. We need to be there to guide them, to coach them, to encourage them, to celebrate them. I mean, we think of our students as digital natives and they know how to do technology, but they can do a TikTok dance, okay? But they don't know how to establish the veracity of a resource online, right? They don't know how to research. So that's our job. And I'm so excited by the educators that have stepped up and used their creativity and overcome their fears to reach out to their students in multiple differentiated ways. I was at the NCCE conference just in March. I was closing keynote, and I just wanted to share the message that I gave to those teachers as we embarked upon this, and that is, don't be afraid of technology and don't be afraid of distance learning. Be fearless. Do it. We've got to be there for our students.
I think that's a really wonderful note to end on. And in the chat, I have shared a lot of resources, especially our email address. So for those of you that want to be put in touch with any of our panelists, or if any of you have been inspired to pursue a Fulbright opportunity of your own after hearing from all of our lovely panelists, you can reach out to us and we will be happy to put you in touch with the appropriate contact. So that's it for today. I just want to say thank you so much to all of our attendees for being here, and also to our lovely panelists for giving us their time. We really appreciate, everything that you had to share today. Vincent, do you have anything else you want to say before I end the webinar?
I just wanted to say on behalf of the department, thank you so much for showing up today and for, no matter what time it is or all the other commitments that you have, for being with us on the panel. It's a really great opportunity to hear from Fulbright alumni who are doing such great things. What you guys are doing in this sort of unprecedented time is astounding. And I think that today we've really only scratched the surface of the what education will be and is sort of morphing into in the future. And I think the issues that we brought up are really very important. I wanted and I need to thank Kate and the IIE team, as well as my ECA outreach team, Melissa and Daria, for the work that they did to put this together. Thank you guys very much. And we look forward to hosting you guys on future webinars. We've got some ideas in the works, including one on nurses, including one on the ADA at 30, and also something for music and the arts. So we'll see you guys again real soon, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.